Hey, we're live.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's the one, the only Senor Silverback himself. And you know what? It's Thursday. It's 12 in the afternoon here in the Eastern Seaboard. And you guys know what time it is. It's time to hang with Harley, a man that needs no introduction. He is the voice of sanity and clarity as the world gets more and more confusion and more perplexed. So without any further ado, Harley, how are you, sir?
I'm doing fine, V. Good to be with you today.
Great to be with you. You know, what's going on? Where do we begin? I mean, apart from the pollen counts and the stupidity counts we were talking about earlier before we went live, what else is causing this your blood pressure to rise? I mean, where do we begin?
If you want to talk about stupidity counts,
Yeah.
you have to start with the Federal Reserve.
Oh yeah.
I mean, besides the fact that it shouldn't exist and that its main purpose from the beginning has been to give the large New York City banks and the associated banks control over the government, control over the money supply, and so on.
Mm-hmm.
You just don't know what they're smoking over there. You know, their meeting yesterday where they raised interest rates. They came up with what they said was a program to deal with this $4.5 trillion balance sheet they've got. They have no program for it. Their argument that the U.S. economy is in good shape, and while we're not seeing any inflation yet, don't worry, it's coming because of the strong labor numbers. I mean, the strong artificial. We have the highest non-participation rate in the labor force that we've ever had.
Yeah.
And the idea that this is a strong sign of a recovery is nonsense. And I see the same thing reflected in Europe. But in Europe, they're afraid of the higher US interest rates because they know that the European economy cannot take any kind of further cutoff of credit. Now, there was a report from the Union Bank of Switzerland today on the problem of what they're calling the, what do they call it? Well, they're saying that the new credit as a percentage of GDP is falling. And they say this is a dynamic similar to 2008. So we're having one report after another about signs of the same kind of problems with leverage, with corporate debt, with financial debt, with speculative debt. Now this one, new credit at GDP, it continues to fall, which means that no one is making loans. And once that hits the consumer sector, as it is now, with the drop in auto sales and home sales, you're seeing a bubble on the verge of popping. So under these circumstances, for the Federal Reserve to say things are strong, therefore we can raise interest rates, is just a sign of idiocy. There's nothing else you can say, but what's the purpose behind it? They're trying to figure out how they can avoid a hyperinflation, which is what they're really afraid of. At the same time, the argument that they have of stimulating the economy is the best way to stimulate it is let the private sector make loans, and the private sector is not making loans. So it's a contradiction inside a riddle inside a puzzle, I guess.
Absolutely. I mean, they got like $4.5 trillion and growing up. It's probably even more. This is not counting all the dumped U.S. Treasury bonds that they've been bolt holing in places like Euroclear, in Brussels, Belgium, in the Cayman Islands, in Liechtenstein, in Ireland, where they're just bolt holding all this stuff in order to manipulate the bond market. It's going to be interesting to see how all of this comes to play, especially now that more and more you see the diminishment of the role of the United States on the world stage. Recently, we heard that in Syria, they're about putting the finishing touches on ISIS. They've concentrated 50,000 troops in one area. And if you notice, there's no U.S. airstrike. Why? Because Lavrov made it very clear, no more U.S. airstrikes. There's nothing happening. So it just shows you how on the world stage, the U.S. is not the leader anymore that people are looking to.
Well, the U.S. will have a changed role in this new development. But just to go back to the financial thing, I want to bring up one other point, which I think is worth noting. I think your listeners will appreciate hearing because it's coming from Europe. Last week you had this bailout of a Spanish bank, the Banco Popular. And this was not a bailout, it was a bail-in. they took a large amount of money from subordinated bondholders, which is basically another word for people who were swindled into buying financial paper of the bank, their customers. And the bank was sold to Santander Bank for €1, which means Santander is going to get all the assets. The people who were invested in this are losing their assets, and the government's going to throw in a little bit of money to make it profitable for Santander Bank. Now, what happened today in Italy is two Venetian banks, the Popolare Venezia and the Veneto Banco, are going to be sold to larger banks, one of which is Unicredit, which is one of the bankrupt banks of Italy. Now, the condition for the sale is, you guessed it, a bail-in. So who's being bailed in? Retail bank customers who were sold what they were told were safe bonds that promised a 10% yield. And of course, they never got a 10% yield. Now they're losing their money. A total of €1.25 billion is going to be taken from these bondholders. And then the Monte dei Paschi Bank is about to have another bail-in. And in this one, 40,000 owners of subordinate bonds totaling €2.1 billion will be bailed in. And the bank is saying, well, that's only 25% of what they're holding. But they're holding what they thought was equity in the bank. And now they're finding out, no, it's bail-in funds that will go to whoever takes over Monte dei Paschi or to pay off the debt of the bank. So we're seeing this bail-in process in Europe underway. And the same bail-in process will take place in the United States when US banks like Wells Fargo, Bank of America, Citibank, and others start to collapse. So people who think they have money locked up in decent bonds and who believe the Federal Reserve propaganda that the economy is in good shape are going to find out that they're going to open their pension accounts or their 401ks, and moths are going to fly out of it.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's the reality that they're facing, that they all will be facing, Harley. What else is on your radar, man?
Well, I wanted to go through this brief picture of the financial situation.
Sure, go ahead.
The point that's why you see this continuing escalation against the Trump administration. You know, the thing that's amazing is that you just had the three stooges, Brennan, Clapper, and Comey, admit of collusion. But now they have evidence, they say, of obstruction of justice. And what's obstructed? Well, the fact that Trump is insisting that he didn't have any collusion is to them a sign of an obstruction, because that's why they can't get the evidence. You know, it's one of these fallacies of logic. But meanwhile, the New York Times, the Washington Post, daily are saying the Trump administration is nearing its end. Then you have the shooting in Washington where a Republican congressman is in critical condition.
Yeah.
And the media is saying, well, it's Trump's fault for spawning violence. So this is where you see that the United States, if Trump could get his act together and go with the policies he's been pushing, namely no more free trade, no more Paris Climate Conference, no more capitulation to the globalists on strategic confrontation with Russia and China. He's laid out the right direction, all of which, by the way, has been what Lyndon LaRouche has been talking about for 15, 20 years. But he's got to start delivering, which means he's got to stop worrying about what the Democrats are going to say and also what some of the Republicans are going to say. And the place to start is infrastructure. There was a conference yesterday in New York City with Chinese officials coming there and again saying, we'd like to help rebuild your infrastructure. Now, what New Yorker would be opposed to that? I mean, someone who thinks the Chinese are going to send 10 million Chinese to take over New York City?
No, exactly.
So, and in the audience, you had a number of US officials who were enthusiastic about working with the Chinese. So this is where Trump is headed, toward this kind of collaboration. And as Brennan himself said in Australia, they're afraid that Trump will actually make arrangements with Russia and China, and that this will break up the whole globalist game. And that's why American people should support what he's doing. We need to break up this globalist game. It's been killing us.
I agree wholeheartedly, man. You know, a lot of people are taking the shooting of the congressman, and some talking heads are instigating an American civil war. And the voice of reason in this whole entire thing that I like to put out there is, it's not a civil war. This is the death rattles of a dying jackal. This is the end of a system that's going away. And the vast majority of people want it to go away. The vast majority of people and Americans are for Trump. They understand that there's a complete disconnect from what is being portrayed on dish rags like the New York Times and the Washington Post and other types of media of ill repute like MSLSD and CNBS and, you know, CNN.
The Coup News Network.
The Coup News Network, exactly. These are you know, mockingbird operations designed that nobody's even watching them, nobody's even listening to them. I can understand, Harley, if these outlets and these venues had audiences that they actually would listen. That's not the case. So, you know, a lot of those people that are saying this is some sort of, you know, the first shot or the first volley of the new American Civil War, it really isn't. This is a lone nut job left-winger, and it's about time. And I'm curious to see how the left-wing nut jobs were always talking about and advocating gun control and all these other things. Now we see that the mask is off. They are the violent, virulent left. They've finally been exposed, and I love the more and more these things are happening, the more the left and that mask that they've hidden behind of peace and love is falling apart, Harley.
Well, and the obvious point here is that it really isn't left or right. I mean, you have nut jobs who are being sent out to do these things by the deep state. I mean, I'm sure we'll find out at some point. In fact, we already know this guy was known as a violent guy.
Yep.
So how do we know that this wasn't another false flag?
Exactly.
And it sends a message to Trump. That's the whole point. The media, the MSNBC, the left-wing blogs are saying things like, well, getting back what he's spawning. His violent rhetoric is causing this.
Mm-hmm.
Well, you know, the fact that you have nuts who can be triggered,
right?
The lone assassin, this kind of thing. That's what we're looking at. And at the same time, you have the New York Times defending the Shakespeare in the Park, Julius Caesar, which essentially is Trump as Julius Caesar getting viciously knifed, as the Shakespeare play has it. But it's Trump up there. You know, the Kathy Griffin thing. You know, they're setting the stage for there to be this kind of violent eruption, which would include assassination, which could include impeachment based on what?
Nothing.
So, you know, I think people have to go back to this point. What is it that the establishment that's out to destroy Trump is afraid of and was afraid of from the moment they found out that he was the president? It's that he potentially is moving the United States out from under the control of the globalists, out from under the control of these Wall Street, City of London banks. And it's also worth noting that the UK is in a complete state of turmoil right now between the fact that they're admitting there are more than 20,000 jihadists running free in England who are basically known as jihadists by the intelligence services, and in many cases on the payroll of the intelligence services, including when May herself was the interior minister. You have the terror strikes there, you have a weak economy, you had the rejection of the Tory party in the elections. The political parties of the establishment are collapsing.
Right.
You know, people say, well, in France, we saw something different. Well, the political parties of the establishment collapsed, and the flavor of the day is called Macron. But Macron is really a cross-dressing Merkel.
Right.
What's going to happen when he starts implementing the policies that he says he's going to make so-called Europe work? It's going to be more unemployment in France, more immigration of people who probably shouldn't be allowed in, more austerity, more cutbacks, and people are going to rebel against him.
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, the idea that somehow there's a new stability in Europe is a lot of nonsense.
I agree with you wholeheartedly. There is no stability. In fact, there's probably more instability, and that is the multi-trillion-dollar question. What's going to happen when the French realize that Macron is going to make things worse? That I mean, they can just wind up like the Swedes. Have you seen the Swedes? They've banned basically free speech at this point.
Well, and this is the way totalitarianism doesn't come from an authority figure who moves against the deep state. It's the deep state moving to assert their complete control over everything,
Yep.
using a false narrative of having to face down a fascist regime. The idea that Trump is the fascist, when the CIA, the three stooges, Brennan, Comey, and Clapper, were the ones who established the police state. Isn't it interesting that in the shift of Democrats away from being critics of the police state into being proponents of it, are embracing Comey? What was one of Comey's roles, or Clapper's role? It was data, so-called metadata collection. It was tapping into the internet, into your phone communication. This is something that when the whole Snowden thing hit, the left was up in arms about. Now they're basically saying we need more surveillance of Trump and more leaking. So, this is where you see that there's something totally wrong with the establishment. They've lost control.
Right. Wholeheartedly, totally, completely.
And the big problem is many of our supporters, I'm talking about your listeners, people who are in communication with me, are still cynical about this. They're still saying, well, but Trump isn't doing what we want. Of course not. He's got 10 guns pointed at his head. They're saying, well, aren't the bankers really running this because they want to crash so they can put in their new system? Well, their new system is not the Belt and Road.
Right.
Their new system is not the Chinese, the Russians, the Brazilians, and the South Africans working together. That's what they've been trying to stop for years.
Correct.
That's why they put Lyndon LaRouche in prison in 1988, 89, because when the wall came down, LaRouche's reputation, with his reputation
Aww.
Jack. I'm sorry, V. He's just.
It's okay, man. And that's Harley Jr. right there.
Yeah. He'll be ready for a radio program in a couple of hours, I think.
I think so too, man. God bless. That's awesome.
I mean, if you want, we can just wrap it in a minute. I can just.
No, entirely up to you. It's whatever you want to do.
All right. Well, what I wanted to say in conclusion is that the reason LaRouche was put in prison was precisely because of the direction of the world today. They wanted to see, in a sense, Lyndon LaRouche's revenge against the Bush family, against the deep state, the FBI, the people who put him in prison. The person who headed the Get LaRouche task force was Robert Mueller. When he was, I think, assistant attorney for Massachusetts.
Mm-hmm. Wow.
So we're seeing the same enemies of LaRouche who are the ones trying to pull down Trump.
Yeah, same thing. Absolutely. Now you hit the nail on the head. Harley, we are up at the end of the show, and I know you have to go. With that being said, man, thank you so much for being on. Again, folks, check out LaRouchePack.com to follow all the works that Harley's doing and the entire LaRouche team. Join the fight, join the effort, put your skin in the game, and get it done. Harley Schlanger, thank you so much, and thank you for hanging with us.
Okay, good.
God bless you, Harley. Take care and be safe, my friend.
You want to hear from Jack for a second?
Sure, go ahead. Put him on.
Jack, that's V who's on the screen. You see that?
Hi, buddy.
We almost saw him when we were in New York at Uncle Mike's house.
Yeah. Hi, Jack. How are you?
How are you, Jack?